There's a lot of obviously we've seen a spike with people who suffer from anxiety, people who suffer from different compulsive disorders, things of that nature. In your opinion, and in your practice, have you noticed that folks that maybe tend to have a little bit more anxiety going into these ceremonies maybe shouldn't do it or should? There's a lot of obviously we've seen a spike with people who suffer from anxiety, people who suffer from different compulsive disorders, things of that nature. In your opinion, and in your practice, have you noticed that folks that maybe tend to have a little bit more anxiety going into these ceremonies maybe shouldn't do it or should?
It's really a question around the nature of the disorder. If you have anxiety and the anxiety is something that's manageable, the ceremonies are going to be very, very supportive and helpful for that. If you have a certain, kind of anxiety disorder that could lead to extreme dissociative events or, other kinds of disorders like schizophrenia or bipolar, you need to be really careful how intense you go into these kinds of experiences. And in the Amazonian medicine practices, for different kinds of people experiencing different disorders, you would prescribe a different number of ceremonies and a different trajectory associated with that. So now there's this popular concept of microdosing. Well, for people who have much more significant, severe forms of disorders, you start with the idea of microdosing or much smaller ceremonies, or even where the participant doesn't actually take the psychoactive substance and just the practitioner does. They come to the ceremony and they start to receive different kinds of healing. Depending on their healing trajectory, then you could change the amount of plants you actually use over time. If you have, different kinds of depression, if you have different kinds of just, darkness and mentalization that's taking place, different kinds of emotional states, the ceremonies can be incredibly liberating. I think the big difference for people is that the visionary experience is part and parcel of your mental states. And so a lot of times people dissociate from that and they say, this is happening to me, not I'm creating this experience because this is what I'm bringing to it. Or they anthropomorphize the plants and they say, this grandmother did this to me, or this grandfather did this to me, or this mother plant did this to me, or this spirit of that plant did this to me. And I understand that that's a way of conceptualizing the experience and it's a way of framing the experience. But often there's a coloring to that experience that comes directly from your own psyche and what you're going through. And so in those cases, I just, typically suggest that people try to refrain from creating conclusions and conclusive understandings and statements about the experience and the ceremonies as they're still going through them. And they may find that those ideas like, oh, I got it. This thing said to me this, and this meant that, and that means this, it can evolve over time and change. And for people who have, really dark experiences, often that's coming from the baggage that they're carrying. And, I ultimately learned to frame that if I start to see it in ceremony, that's actually an incredible positive, because that means those aspects of myself are now coming apart and they're kind of being unwoven in this tremendous tapestry of what's going on inside my mind all the time, that I can see a visionary representation of what represents that depression or anxiety or PTSD or darkness or trauma that I'm carrying, or that negative self-critical voice that I may have or something. I'm actually now seeing it separate from me. It's going and it's literally on its way out. When it completely exits the visionary field in the ayahuasca treatment, that person is now healed of that thing. So often somebody starts to see that thing might look like it's talking back to them or challenging them in some way. That's no different than that voice challenging you when you say, I'm going to, get this great spurt of inspiration. And you're like, I'm going to do this thing. And then your own voice starts to criticize and doubt and fear and cut you down. And who are you to think you can do this? And that's no different than seeing this, kind of face looking at me, challenging me in the ceremony. When it got to there, I realized all you have to do is just say goodbye. Like, thank you so much, goodbye. And it leaves, and it's actually another watershed moment of healing. And then after that, in its absence, then, all the light and bliss and kind of like real beauty turns on that we call the medicine.